The number on the glass wall was $40 million, and it had been missing for 6 days. 12 men in $90 shirts had torn the books apart looking for it. Forensic auditors flown in from 3 cities. A former treasury man with a nicotine cough. A boy who'd unwound a hedge fund at 22 and never smiled since. They cross-referenced ledgers until their eyes bled, and they found nothing. By the 6th night they had stopped speaking to each other. The coffee in their cups had grown a skin. At 2:40 in the morning, the woman who emptied their trash set her mop against the wall, leaned over the shoulder of the treasury man, and asked why any building on Earth would spend $40,000 a month on air filters. Then she reached past him and picked up a pen. 9 minutes. That was the whole of it. Rewind 11 hours, to a woman who could not afford the bus. The smell of the number 6 at rush hour was diesel and wet wool, and somebody's fried onions in a foil bag. And Mara Koval breathed it through her mouth, because breathing it through her nose made her stomach turn. She stood because the seats were taken. She always stood. 34 years old, and she had learned the exact angle to lean into a pole so her lower back stopped screaming. And that angle was 17 degrees, and she held it for 40 minutes twice a day. Her knees were the problem now, not the back. The back she'd made peace with. The knees had started clicking in November, and by February they announced her before she entered a room. And she cleaned rooms for a living, so this was a professional inconvenience. The bus fare was $2.90. She had $2.90. She did not have the fare and a coffee, so she did not have a coffee. Her coat was a men's canvas jacket she'd bought at a church sale for $4, the kind lined with a plaid flannel that pilled into little grey beads she picked off in meetings she wasn't part of. Under it a hoodie. Under that, a thermal shirt gone thin at the elbows. She dressed in layers the way poor people and mountain climbers do, for the same reason. You never knew when the cold would find a way in, and you couldn't afford to be caught. She got off at Crail and 9th and walked the 4 blocks to the tower because the transfer cost another $1.50 and the walk was free. The tower had a name, but nobody used it. 61 floors of black glass on the river, and the top 11 belonged to a company called Aurelian Holdings, and Aurelian Holdings belonged, through a nesting doll of shells, to a man Mara had never seen and never expected to. She cleaned floors 40 through 44, finance floors, the kind of floors where the trash was mostly paper, and the paper was mostly shredded, and the men who made the paper looked through her like she was weather. Her supervisor's name was Doreen, and Doreen smelled of menthol cigarettes and the strawberry hard candies she sucked to hide the menthol, so she smelled of both, always, a sweet chemical smog that arrived before her and stayed after. "You're on 40 tonight," Doreen said. "All night. Don't ask questions, don't touch nothing, don't talk to nobody. There's people up there. There's always people up there. Not like this." Doreen unwrapped a candy without looking at it, a magician's flourish worn smooth by 30 years. Suits from outside. Been there since Tuesday. Company's got some kind of problem. She said problem the way you'd say a word in a language you didn't speak. Carefully. At arm's length. You keep your head down, you'll be fine. I keep my head down for a living. That's why I like you, Koval. A candy clicked against her teeth. You're furniture. Best thing a person can be. Up there. Furniture. Mara took the cart. Home, before all this, was a 4th-floor walk-up that smelled of the downstairs neighbor's incense and the radiator's hot metal, and, under everything, cat. The cat's name was Pierogi, and he was 17 years old and dying slowly of his kidneys, the way old cats do, and the prescription food that kept him alive cost $34 a bag, and the bag lasted 11 days. Mara had done the math on this the way she did the math on everything. $3.09 a day to keep the cat. She spent less than that on herself for food most days, and considered it a fair trade, because the cat had been there when the man left, and the license went, and the world folded up like a card table, and the cat didn't ask her a single question about any of it. She'd bought the wrong bag once, chicken instead of the renal formula, because they'd moved the shelves and she was tired, and the bags were the same blue. Pierogi wouldn't touch it, and she couldn't return an opened bag, and she'd sat on the kitchen floor with him and cried about $34 until 2 in the morning. Not about the man, not about the license, about $34 of the wrong cat food. That was the shape grief took now. It came in at strange angles and always through the wallet. Rent was $1,240, due the 1st, and it was the 26th, and she had $800 in the coffee can and $470 in the bank, and that came to $1,270, which sounded fine until you remembered she still had to eat and ride the bus and keep the cat alive for 5 more days before payday. And payday was $640, and the 1st was a Friday. She was $240 short. She had been $240 short her whole life, in one denomination or another. Her landlord was named Mr. Adamski, and he was not cruel, which was worse in a way, because cruelty you could hate cleanly, and a decent man who needed his rent just made you feel the failure was yours. Her days had a shape, and the shape was survival. She woke at 3 in the afternoon with the light already going, because she worked nights and slept days, and had done it so long that sunlight felt like a rumor. She ate the same breakfast at 4, 2 eggs, the bread heels nobody else in the store wanted, coffee she made from grounds she used twice. She wrapped both knees in the elastic braces the drugstore sold 3 for $11, and taped the left one extra because the left one was the one that gave. She counted the exact bus fare into her coat pocket and left the rest of her money in the coffee can, physically, out of the bank, where she could see it and hold it and stop it from being eaten by the small emergencies that ate people like her alive. She knew the transfer schedule of 3 bus lines by heart. She knew which drivers let you ride the last 2 blocks free in the rain and which ones would put you off in a storm to make a point. She knew the tower's night rhythm better than any executive who'd ever worked there, knew the ice machine on 42 ran loud until midnight and went quiet after, knew which stall on 43 had a door that stuck, knew Marcus at the security desk, who shared his thermos of terrible coffee with her at the shift change because he was lonely too, and coffee was the only currency either of them had to spare. That was her whole economy: bus fare and bread heels and a lonely man's thermos, and $34 of cat food she couldn't always cover. She'd built a life so small it could survive on almost nothing, because a life that small was the only kind she could keep from being taken. And she'd have gone on keeping it, invisible, intact, $240 short forever, if she'd only had the sense that one particular night to keep her eyes off the top printout on a dead man's table. The men on 40 didn't know her name, and never would. She'd worked those floors 8 months, and in 8 months exactly one of them had spoken to her, and what he'd said was, "Can you get this?" pointing at a splash of oat milk latte on the carpet without looking up from his phone, and she'd gotten it, on her knees, while he stood over her, taking a call about a number with more zeros than her whole life had ever held. There was a young one, Prentice, who liked an audience. He'd wait until the floor had a few people on it, and then find something for her to do, loudly, a performance of authority for men who already had it. "Sweetheart, there's a situation in the men's room," he'd announce. And the situation was always his, and he always called her sweetheart, and she always fixed it, because being $240 short teaches you to swallow a great many things whole. She'd catalogued each one in the ledger she kept in her head, the one nobody could suspend, and told herself it cost her nothing to be furniture. It cost her something. She just paid it when no one could see. She'd been somebody once. That was the part she didn't let herself hold for longer than a breath, because it had teeth. She'd had a corner office with her name on nothing but a business card that said Senior Forensic Analyst, and she'd been the one they brought in when the numbers lied, because Mara Koval could look at a page of figures the way other people looked at a face and see, instantly, which parts of it were smiling and which parts were afraid. Then she'd looked at the wrong numbers, at a firm with the wrong friends, and she'd been right, and being right had cost her everything a person could be charged for. Her license, suspended pending an investigation that never quite ended and never quite cleared her. Her marriage, which had been more paperwork than passion anyway. Her savings, to the lawyers, her name, in a small industry where a whisper traveled faster than a wire. Now she counted mop water buckets and $34 cat food bags and the exact number of steps to the 4th floor, which was 52, and she did not, ever, let herself count what she used to make in a year. The 44th floor of the tower smelled, that night, of fear and cold espresso, and something underneath both that Mara couldn't place for the first hour, and finally identified as new carpet. They'd recarpeted a conference room in a hurry, and the glue was still off-gassing, chemical and sweetish, a smell like a lie being told very fast. The man everyone was afraid of arrived at 11:20. She knew he'd arrived because the sound of the floor changed. 12 accountants who had been murmuring went silent all at once, the way birds do before weather, and a draft moved down the hall carrying a scent she would come to know better than her own. Cedar and something metallic, cold iron, gun oil maybe, or just the smell a man gets when he's been around a lot of hard things for a long time. Cedar and iron. It cut through the espresso and the carpet glue like a blade through cake. Mara was on her knees in the alcove by the ice machine, scraping a coffee ring off the baseboard with her thumbnail through a rag, and she did not look up, because looking up was not what furniture did. She heard him before she saw him. His voice was quiet. That was the thing she'd remember, how quiet it was, in a room full of men who'd gone silent to hear it. "Tell me where it is," he said. Nobody answered. 6 days, the quiet voice said. "I fly in 12 of the best in the country. I feed you. I pay you what a doctor makes in a month, for a week. And you tell me it's not there." A pause. The espresso machine ticked as it cooled. "It's there. $40 million does not evaporate. It's in the building. I want to know which room." "Mr. Vale." That was the treasury man, the one with the cough. His name, she'd gathered, was Halloran. "We've reconciled every account 3 times. Every wire, every transfer, every—" I don't want to hear the word reconciled again tonight. The way he said it, not loud. He hadn't raised his voice once. But the temperature of the room dropped, and Mara felt it on the back of her neck, and she understood, in her body before her mind caught up, that Damiano Vale was the most dangerous thing she had ever been in a room with, and that he was dangerous precisely because he never had to prove it. Here was the arithmetic, and she assembled it slowly over the next hour, from fragments, the way she assembled everything, from the trash, from the murmurs, from a whiteboard nobody thought to turn away from the cleaning lady. $40 million had been committed to a man they only called the Georgian, against a shipment and a partnership and a set of promises Mara didn't understand and didn't want to. The $40 million was due Friday, the 1st. 6 a.m., not close of business, because the Georgian was the kind of man who chose 6 a.m. to remind you he could. Except the $40 million was gone, not spent, not wired, gone, vanished from the accounts where it should have been sitting, and vanished cleanly, without a hole, which was the part that had 12 forensic accountants grey in the face. There was no missing wire, there was no unexplained transfer. Every account balanced, and yet the money that should have been there was not there, and if it was not there at 6 a.m. Friday, then Damiano Vale would go to a meeting with the Georgian empty-handed, and men who went to that kind of meeting empty-handed did not, as a rule, come to the next one. 3 days, 71 hours, when she did the count, standing in the hall with her cart. 71 hours and $40 million that had learned to be invisible. The Georgian called at midnight. Mara didn't hear the call, but she saw its wake. A phone rang in the corner office. Not a cell, a landline. An old sound in a glass tower, and a hush went through the floor that was different from the earlier hush. Deeper. The hush of men who've heard the specific ring that means the one person their boss answers to has something to say. Damiano took it standing, in profile against the window, and he listened more than he spoke. And Mara, wringing a rag in the alcove, understood she was watching something rare, the most dangerous man in the building being spoken to by someone more dangerous still. She caught 3 words before the door swung shut. "It will be there." That was all. A promise, made by a man who did not make promises he couldn't keep, about $40 million that had learned to disappear, to a creditor who chose 6 a.m. on a Friday to remind everyone what he could do. The door clicked. The hush held. And Mara understood the true arithmetic at last. Not that Damiano would kill you if the money wasn't found, but that Damiano would die if it wasn't found. And a cornered animal that size is the most dangerous thing in any forest. She saw what the fear did to the others, too, from the edge of it. One of the 12, the hedge fund boy whose name was Okafor and who couldn't have been 30, made a mistake around 1. He pulled the wrong quarter onto the big screen, 4th instead of 3rd, and caught it a beat too late, and in the 2 seconds it took him to fix it, every man in the room went rigid, as if the boy had knocked over a glass in a house where glasses were not knocked over. Nobody looked at Damiano. That was the tell. In an ordinary company, the men would have glanced at the boss to gauge the damage. Here they looked anywhere else, at their shoes, the window, the backs of their own hands, because looking at Damiano Vale when something went wrong was a way of volunteering, and no one volunteered. Damiano hadn't even seen it. He'd been at the glass with his back to the room, a black shape against a blacker river. But the fear didn't need him watching. It had been installed a long time ago and ran on its own power now, and that, Mara understood, was the whole architecture of the man. He'd made himself into a weather system, and weather doesn't have to threaten you. It only has to exist, over your city, all the time. Mara knew a thing or two about learning to be invisible. She wheeled the cart into the big conference room at 2:15 to do the trash, and the room was empty of men for the first time all night. They'd gone down a floor to shout at each other where he couldn't hear, and the whiteboard was covered in their handwriting, and the long table was covered in printouts, and the glass wall had a number written on it in red marker, $40 million, with a circle around it and a question mark, as if a circle and a question mark had ever found anybody anything. She emptied the first bin. She emptied the second, and on her way to the third, her eyes went across the top printout the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth, without deciding to, because she could no more not read a page of numbers than you could not hear your own name in a crowd. It was a vendor ledger. Operating expenses, 1 floor of the building, 1 quarter. She read it for about 4 seconds. Then she stopped and stood very still and read it again. The thing about hiding $40 million is that everybody who tries to hide it makes the same mistake. They make it disappear. They send it somewhere, and the moment money goes somewhere, it leaves a road, and a road can be followed, and 12 accountants, who followed roads for a living, had followed every road out of this building for 6 days and found that none of them carried $40 million, because it had never left. Mara's thumb moved down the vendor ledger, and her lips moved without sound, and her hammering heart did a thing it hadn't done in 3 years. It woke up. Facilities. Building maintenance. The line item that every executive's eye slides over the way her own eye slid over the men in the hall. Air handling. Filtration. HVAC servicing. Pest control. Elevator maintenance. Window washing. The invisible, unglamorous, deeply boring cost of keeping a black glass tower alive. And nobody audits the boring stuff, because the boring stuff is where the money is small, and the money is small everywhere except right here, where a single line read, Air filtration servicing, 47th 52nd floors. Monthly retainer, $41,200. Mara had cleaned buildings for 3 years. She had also, in her other life, audited a hospital, a defense contractor, and a shipping company, and she knew to the dollar what it cost to service the air in a tower like this. And it was not $41,200 a month, it was closer to $4,000. And she knew something else, too. Something the 12 men in the $90 shirts did not know, because they had never in their lives held a real invoice for real building work. The vendor was called Sterical Environmental Services. And Sterical Environmental Services had 11 sister vendors on the same ledger. Sterical Filtration, Vestcal Air, Meridian Facilities Group, Blue Ridge Building Systems, on and on. 12 vendors in all, each one billing between $9,000 and $41,000 a month for services to a building that Mara personally cleaned and had never once seen any of them perform. 12 vendors, 12 accountants. Somebody had a sense of humor. She did the math in her head, because her head still did math even when the rest of her had given up on being anything but furniture. 12 vendors, averaging around $30,000 a month, across the top 15 floors. Going back, she flipped the pages. 22 months. She carried it. She rounded. She landed on a number that made the hair stand up on her arms. It came out to a little over $40 million. The money hadn't been stolen out of the building. It had been renamed. It was sitting right there, in plain sight, dressed up as the cost of clean air and working elevators. In the one budget line, important men are constitutionally incapable of reading. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply put on a janitor's uniform and stood in the corner, and 12 of the best forensic minds in the country had looked straight through it, because that is what you do to a janitor. They came back at 2:38. She heard the elevator. She should have stepped away from the table. Furniture does not read the ledger. She did not step away from the table. Halloran came in first and saw the cleaning woman standing over his printouts with a pen she'd taken from the tray, and his face went through surprise into anger. Hey! Hey! You can't. Your air filters, Mara said. What? You're paying $41,000 a month to service the air filters on 6 floors. She kept her eyes on the page. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, because the voice was the last thing that hadn't quit on her. I clean this building. Real filter service on floors like this runs $3-4 grand a month, all in. Somebody's overpaying by $37,000 to one vendor, and there are 11 more just like it, and they've been billing for 22 months. The room had filled behind Halloran. 12 men, and then, in the doorway, the cedar and the iron. Damiano Vale did not say anything. Mara turned the top page around so it faced them, and she drew a circle, a real circle, around a real thing, not a question mark around a number, and she said, "The money never left. You've been looking for a wire out. There's no wire out. It's expensed. It went out the front door $40,000 at a time, in checks small enough that nobody signs off on them personally, to 12 vendors that don't do anything, and it's been landing somewhere for 2 years. You find the account behind Sterikal, you'll find most of your 40 million. The rest'll be in the other 11. She set the pen down. Whoever set this up knew you'd never audit facilities. You people never look at us. Silence. It was the kind of silence that has a texture. 12 men not breathing. The espresso machine, ticking. Somewhere far below, the city, indifferent. Mara became aware of her own pulse in her ears, and of the fact that she was $240 short on rent, and had just, possibly, done something very stupid in front of the most dangerous man she had ever met. Damiano Vale crossed the room. He did not hurry. He picked up the page she'd circled, and he looked at it, and then he looked at her, and it was the first time anyone on that floor had looked at her and not through her in 3 years, and it landed on her like weather. 9 minutes, he said quietly. It was not a question. He'd been watching the clock the way she watched the clock, out of habit, out of hunger. You walked in 9 minutes ago. I was doing the trash. 12 men, 6 days. He set the page down with terrible gentleness. You, 9 minutes. They were looking in the wrong place. Mara picked up her mop. I clean the wrong place for a living. They put her in a room after that. Not a cell. A room with a leather couch and a view, and a bottle of water she didn't touch, because you don't drink the water in a stranger's trap. She sat with her $4 coat in her lap, and her hands folded on it, and she waited, and she thought about Pierogi, who needed feeding at 6, and about the bus, which stopped running at 1 and started again at 5, and about the fact that whatever happened in the next hour, she was probably going to miss the 5:15. Damiano came in alone, at 3:50. He'd taken off the jacket, white shirt, sleeves folded to the forearm, and on the left forearm, a scar that ran from wrist to elbow like a seam in a leather chair, old and white and precise, the kind of scar that doesn't come from an accident. He sat across from her. He set a glass of something amber down on the table, for himself, and did not offer her one, which she respected. The offer would have been a move, and he was, she was beginning to understand, always making moves, but this once he wasn't insulting her with one. Halloran confirmed it, he said. 2 hours of work. Sterikal traces to a holding account in the name of a man who's been dead since 2019. From there it ladders through 3 more, and lands somewhere he's still pulling apart. But you were right about the shape of it. He turned the glass a quarter turn on the table. You want to tell me how a woman who empties my trash reads a forensic ledger like a menu? No. The quarter turn stopped. No, she said again. With respect, that's my business. And the last time I told a powerful man my business, it took my license, and my house, and 11 years of everything I'd built. So you'll forgive me if I keep the one thing I've got left, which is that I don't have to tell you anything. He looked at her for a long moment, cedar and iron, across a coffee table. How much do you make? He said. Cleaning my floors. $640 a week, before the bus. I'll pay you $200,000, Damiano said, in the same flat quiet he'd used to frighten 12 men, to find the rest of it. This week, before Friday. The number sat in the air. $200,000 was rent for 13 years. It was the cat, forever. It was her license reinstated, maybe, if the right lawyer got the right hearing. It was the $4 coat in a drawer, and a coat that fit. It was every angle of every pole on every bus. Forgiven. Mara said, "No." "Explain that to me," Damiano said, and for the first time something moved in his face. Not anger, curiosity, the dangerous kind. The kind that means a man has decided you're worth understanding, which is the most expensive thing you can become to someone like him. "You want the boring version or the honest one?" "Both." "The boring version." She counted on her fingers, and her fingers were steady now, because logistics were the one place she'd always been able to stand. 1. $200,000 that appears in my account is a red flag to a licensing board that already thinks I'm dirty, and if I ever want to work again, really work, I can't be a woman who took a bag of cash from Aurelian Holdings. 2. There's no clean way for you to pay me that a bank doesn't ask about, which means it's cash, which means it's a felony for both of us the second it changes hands, and I've already been convicted in every way but the legal one, so I'm particular about the legal one. 3. She held up a third finger. Whoever built the Stericol thing works for you. Still, tonight. And when you find your 40 million, they're going to figure out who found it. And I'd like to keep cleaning trash, quietly, and not become a woman that a very frightened, very clever thief has a reason to think about. The room was quiet. "That's the boring version," Damiano said. "Yes. And the honest one." Mara looked at him, at the scar, at the amber glass, at the cedar and the iron, and the awful stillness of him, and she surprised herself. "The honest one is that a man exactly like you ruined my life the last time I was useful to him," she said. "And you're offering me money the way he offered me money. And I've learned to be afraid of the offer more than the threat, because the threat's honest and the offer isn't." She stood and put on the $4 coat, and it was the poorest garment in that building by a factor of 1,000, and she wore it like a coronation. "I found your money." That was a professional courtesy, because I couldn't stand watching 12 grown men circle a whiteboard for 6 days when the answer was in the trash. "We're square. I'm going to go feed my cat." She got to the door. "Mrs. Koval," not Mrs. She was no one's wife anymore, but she didn't correct him, because there was something in how he said it. "The cat? What kind?" She turned. "What? You said you're going to feed your cat? At 4 in the morning. A woman doesn't leave $200,000 on a table and mention her cat, unless the cat is the realest thing she owns." He hadn't moved. "What kind?" 17 years old. "Kidneys are failing. He eats a prescription food that costs $34 a bag, and I can't always afford it." She heard herself saying it, and could not have said why. "His name is Pierogi. Good night, Mr. Vale." She went home. She fed the cat. She did not sleep. Morning arrived with rain and the smell of the radiator boiling the incense damp out of the walls, and Mara went to work the next night the way she always did, on the number 6, 17 degrees against the pole, and told herself the whole thing was over. It was not over. It is never over once a man like that has seen you. There was a bag outside her apartment door when she got home the second night. A plain brown paper bag, folded at the top. Inside it, 6 bags of the renal formula cat food, $34 each, and nothing else. No note, no name. She stood in the hallway, holding $204 of cat food, and understood that this was not a gift. This was a sentence. This was cedar and iron saying, "I listen when you talk, and I can find your door, and I did the one thing you couldn't do for the thing you love most, and now you owe me a debt that money could never have bought." It was the most frightening thing anyone had ever done to her, and it worked, and she hated that it worked, and she sat on the floor with Pierogi eating the right food for once, and she did the math she'd sworn she'd never do again. $240 short, every month. Forever. Or, the card was in the bag after all. She found it at the bottom, under the last box. Heavy stock, cream, blank, but for a phone number in black ink, and, beneath it, 3 words in a hard, slanted hand. "On your terms." That was the trap. Not the money, the 3 words. He'd listened to every objection she'd made, and he'd answered them not with more money, but with your terms, which meant he'd give her the clean version, the licensed version, the safe version, whatever version let her say yes without losing the last thing she owned. He'd turned her own logistics against her. He was, she thought, the smartest, dangerous man she had ever met, and she was going to call the number, and she knew it, and she poured the last of the boxed wine into a jam jar and drank it, and called the number at 1:14 in the morning. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been holding the phone. "My terms," Mara said, "are a contract. A real one, a consulting agreement, forensic accounting services, on paper, taxed, W-9, the works. Aurelian pays a licensed firm, and I subcontract through a shell I control, so my name never touches your name. 60,000, not 200, because 200 is a number that gets a person killed, and 60 is a number a firm bills for a hard month. And when it's done, it's done. I find your thief, I hand you the file, I go back to my mop, and you never send me cat food again, because the next time you touch my door, I'll assume you've come to close the account." The quiet on the line had a smile in it. She could hear it. "Agreed," Damiano said. "I'm not for sale." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm buying." The 47th floor smelled of money in a way the lower floors didn't. Not cash, but the idea of cash. That cold, clean scent of glass cleaner and orchid, and the leather of chairs nobody sat in. A smell engineered to make you feel poor. Mara walked into it at 9 the next morning in the one blazer she owned, a grey thing from a consignment shop that fit through the shoulders and lied about everything else. And she felt every one of the 12 accountants clock the fact that the cleaning lady had come back in a blazer. Halloran had a workspace set up for her. He was decent about it, in the end. A man who'd spent 30 years finding money and had just been outfound by a stranger with a mop, and had chosen, to his credit, to be curious rather than cruel. He gave her the master ledgers, the entity chart, the bank access, and a coffee, black, without asking, which was how she knew he'd been watching her the first night too. "The dead man's account," she said, spreading pages. "Sterical ladders into it. Show me who has signatory authority. That's the thing." Halloran coughed into his fist. "Nobody. It's automated. Standing instructions, set up 2 years ago, and the instructions came from inside the compliance office." Mara went still. Compliance. The office whose entire job was to make sure the money was clean. The fox with the keys to the henhouse and a badge that said, "Fox Prevention." "Who runs compliance?" she said. Halloran didn't answer with a name. He answered with his eyes, which flicked, once, toward the glass office at the end of the floor, where a man in a suit worth more than Mara's building sat with his feet on the desk, laughing into a phone. Handsome, relaxed. The only relaxed man on a floor full of frightened ones. "Renzo Calla," Halloran said quietly. "Mr. Vale's cousin, runs compliance, which means he audits the vendors." A pause. "Which means for 2 years, the man in charge of catching this has been the man signing off on it." The trap Mara had walked into had a trap inside it, and she'd known it would, because they always did. Renzo Calla came to find her himself, on the second afternoon. She smelled him before she saw him. Where Damiano was cedar and iron, Renzo was cologne, expensive and loud, a citrus and leather thing, applied by a man who thought more was the same as better. He leaned on the edge of her borrowed desk and smiled down at her with a mouthful of very white teeth. "So you're the cleaning lady," he said. "The one who did the magic trick. Everybody's talking about it." He picked up one of her printouts, glanced at it, understood none of it, set it down upside down. "My cousin gets these ideas, brings in a ringer, shakes the tree, sees what falls out. It's a management style." He tapped the desk twice with one manicured finger. "Word of advice, from somebody who's been in this family a long time. There's finding things, and there's finding things that are better left found by nobody. You seem smart. Smart people know which is which." Mara looked up at him with the face she'd perfected over 3 years of being furniture. Flat, patient, empty as a wiped table. "I just do the numbers," she said. "I don't know anything about which is which." "Good." The teeth again. "Keep it that way, sweetheart." Sweetheart? The second man in a month to hand her that word like a leash. She smiled back, small and closed, and thought, "I have you in a spreadsheet, and you don't even know a spreadsheet can hold a man." But she said nothing, because furniture says nothing, and furniture had turned out to be the best disguise she'd ever worn. He left a cloud of citrus and leather behind him. It took 3 hours to fade. She worked straight through it, and every hour she worked the case around him closed a little tighter, and he went home that night to his club and his car, and his 82-foot boat, whistling. A dead man who didn't know it yet, because he'd never once thought to check the janitor's budget. She worked for 2 days, she barely slept, and she didn't mind, because the not sleeping felt like the old not sleeping, the good kind, the kind that came from a puzzle instead of a fear. She built it the way she used to build a case. Not the money, the shape of the money. She traced Sterikal into the dead man's account, and the dead man's account into a currency exchange in a city she'd never visit, and the currency exchange into a real estate fund, and the real estate fund into a boat, literally a boat. $40 million had become, among other things, an 82-foot boat, registered to a company, registered to a lawyer, registered to a mailbox, and Mara found the boat on a Tuesday afternoon and laughed out loud in the silent office. One sharp bark, and 12 heads came up. She apologized to the room with a small wave and went back in. The boat was the joke. The boat wasn't the case. Anybody could buy a boat. What she needed was the seam where a careful man had, exactly once, been careless. Because there is always a seam. Money is patient, and thieves are not. And somewhere in 2 years, and 260 fake invoices, there would be a single human fingerprint. A place where the machine had needed a person, and a person is a thing that leaves a mark. But a boat wasn't a thief. A boat was a purchase. She needed the hand that signed, and the hand had been careful. Everything automated, everything at arm's length, everything deniable. Renzo Calla had built a machine that stole for him, so that he'd never have to be caught touching the money. Except everybody makes the same mistake. They hide the money, and the money leaves a road. And Renzo, who'd been so careful with the money, had been careless with the one thing careful men are always careless with, the boring stuff. The vendor accounts had to be maintained. Somebody had to log in, once a month, and approve the fake invoices before the automated system paid them, because even a machine needs a human to say yes the first time. And every login left a stamp, a time, a device, an IP address, the digital equivalent of a footprint in wet cement. 12 fake vendors, 22 months, 260-odd approvals, each one a footprint. Mara pulled the logs. It took her 4 hours and a favor Halloran called in from IT. And when the logs came up, she sorted them not by vendor and not by amount, but by time of day, because that was how she thought, in the rhythms of when people did things, and a pattern stood up off the page and looked her in the eye. Every approval, 2 years of them, logged between 2 and 4 a.m. Renzo Calla, cousin of Damiano Valle, head of compliance, approved his fake invoices in the dead middle of the night, from a device that pinged a tower 6 blocks from a nightclub he was known to close down, because he did it drunk, on his way home, thumbing approve, approve, approve in the back of a car, $40,000 at a time, for 2 years, and he'd been so sure no one would ever look at the boring stuff that he'd never once thought to hide when. She had him. She had him in a spreadsheet, cross-referenced, time-stamped, tied to a boat. She printed it. She put it in a folder. And at 2 a.m. on the third night, the same hour Renzo did his stealing, which felt correct, she carried the folder to the top floor, where cedar and iron waited, and she set it on the desk, and she said, "It's your cousin. It's been your cousin the whole time. Here's the time, the device, the account, and the boat. He did it drunk at 2 in the morning for 2 years because he was sure nobody would ever check the janitor's budget." She stepped back. "I've done what you paid me for. The file's clean. My name's not on it. We're done." Damiano opened the folder. He read it the way he did everything, without hurry, and the only sign that anything had landed was a small thing, a thing Mara almost missed. His thumb, on the edge of the page, went white at the nail. That was all. A cousin's 2-year betrayal, $40 million, a boat, and the man's entire reaction was a thumb going white and then, slowly, letting go. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure of the numbers. I'm never sure of the people, but the numbers are sure of the people." She nodded at the folder. "That's him, to the minute, for 2 years." Damiano closed the folder. He picked up the phone on the desk, and he dialed one number, and he waited, and when someone answered he said, in the same quiet, the same flat, the same whether that drops the temperature voice, "Bruno, Renzo's on the boat this weekend." The 82-footer. Make sure he takes it out. All the way out. A pause. And Bruno. Nothing that floats back. He hung up. The silence that followed was the worst one yet, because Mara understood, standing in it, exactly what she had just done, and exactly what kind of man she had just handed a folder to, and exactly how the boring stuff, the timestamps, the vendor logs, the janitor's budget 40 grand a month, ended with a man on a boat and nothing that floats back. She had wanted to be useful again. She had forgotten what she was useful to. I didn't sign up for that part, she said. Her mouth had gone dry. You signed up to find the money. Damiano set the folder in a drawer and locked it. What I do with the man who took it isn't in your contract. That's the clean version. You said you wanted the clean version. He looked up at her, and for 1 second the stillness cracked. Just slightly, just enough for her to see that it cost him something too. The cousin, the boat, the water. You're not a killer, Mara. I know. That's why I let you keep your hands clean. Somebody in this building has to. Here was the trap, fully sprung, and she felt it close with the quiet click of a well-made lock. She hadn't wired money into an offshore account. She hadn't held a gun. She'd drawn a circle around a name, on paper, taxed, W9, the works, her own terms, the clean version she'd demanded, and the clean version had walked a man onto a boat. That was the genius of a place like this. It never asked you to become a monster. It only asked you to be good at one small thing, in one small room, and then it carried the rest to the water, while your hands stayed spotless and your conscience filed its objection in triplicate. She'd wanted to be useful. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted, and the getting of it had a body count, and both of those facts were true at once, and neither one cancelled the other. And that, she understood, was what it meant to come from the same dirt as a man like Damiano Valle. She should have left. She got her coat, she got as far as the elevator, and then she came back, because she'd left her folder copy on the desk and because, she'd tell herself later, she wanted the copy, but the truth was, she didn't want to be alone on the number 6 at 3 a.m. with what she'd just learned about herself. By 3 a.m., the top floor smelled of rain on the glass, and of the whiskey he'd finally poured a second glass of, and this time he pushed it across the desk to her, and this time she took it, because the rules had changed somewhere in the last hour, and they both knew it. They didn't talk about the boat. You had a corner office once, Damiano said. It wasn't a guess. He'd looked into her, the way he looked into everything, and she found she didn't mind, or minded less than she should. Forensic. Good. Then it went away. It went away. The whiskey was very good, and she drank it too fast. I found $40 million once before, in a firm that had powerful friends, and I did the right thing and reported it. And the powerful friends decided the cleanest solution was that I was the one who'd stolen it, suspended my license, buried me in an investigation that never ends and never clears. By the time the lawyers were done, I was cleaning offices. She turned the glass. I did the right thing. It cost me everything. So don't tell me I'm not a killer like it's a compliment. Doing the right thing is what got me here. Wiping tables. He was quiet. Cedar and iron and rain. We come from the same dirt, he said finally. You know that. I clean the dirt, you come from it. My mother cleaned offices. He said it flatly. No reach for pity. A fact laid on the table like the folder. This building. Not this one. The old one. On Kessler. Before I owned anything. She had knees like yours. She used to come home at 4 in the morning smelling of the lemon stuff, and she'd sit on the edge of my bed so I'd know she made it back, and I'd pretend to be asleep so she wouldn't feel bad about waking me. He looked at his glass. I know exactly what your hands feel like. I watched hers turn into wood. Mara looked at her own hands, cracked at the knuckles from the mop water, old before their time. Why me? She said. You could hire anyone. You did hire 12 anyones. I hired 12 men who'd been taught to look up. He turned the amber glass a slow quarter turn, the tick she'd started to read as thinking. The whole system's built to make people look up. At the wire, at the account, at the man in the corner office. Nobody's trained to look down, at the small line, at the boring number, at the floor. Except the person who spent 3 years on the floor. He looked at her. You didn't find my money because you're smarter than they are, though you might be. You found it because you've been made invisible, and invisible people are the only ones who ever see where the important ones aren't looking. It was, Mara thought, the truest thing anyone had said to her in a decade. And it had come from a man who'd just ordered another man drowned, and she didn't know what to do with a world where those two things lived in the same throat. That's a very pretty way to describe a woman who mops, she said. It's a very pretty woman who mops. She let that sit. She didn't pick it up, and she didn't put it down. She let it sit in the middle of the desk between them, like the folder had, like the whiskey did. One more dangerous thing they'd both agreed not to touch yet. He reached across the desk. He didn't take her hand. He was too careful for that, and so was she. But he turned her wrist, gently, one finger, to where a bruise ran along the bone, a deep one, purple going green, from catching herself on the cart 3 nights ago when her knee gave. His touch was warm. She hadn't expected warm. This, he said. You did this here, on my floor, cleaning up after 12 men who couldn't find their own money. I'm clumsy. You're exhausted. His finger stayed on the bruise for 1 second longer than it needed to, and she felt the second, the way you feel a match struck in a dark room, sudden and total, and then, deliberately, put out. He let go of her wrist. He sat back. Finish your drink. Bruno will drive you. It's raining. She finished her drink. Her heart was doing the hammering thing, and it wasn't the whiskey, and it wasn't fear, and she was old enough and burned enough to know the difference, and to be furious at herself for the not fear. This doesn't happen, she said, standing. No, he agreed. It doesn't, which was not the same as it won't, and they both heard that too. Bruno drove her home in a car that smelled of leather and menthol, and, faintly, of the sea, which she chose not to think about. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. He walked her to the door of her building, which she hadn't asked him to do, and waited until she was inside, which she hadn't asked either, and it occurred to her that she now had a bodyguard, and that she'd acquired him the way you acquire everything from a man like Damiano Val, without agreeing to it, as a gift that was a sentence. Pierogi was waiting inside, thin and patient, and she fed him the good food, and she sat on the kitchen floor, in her wet coat, and the folder copy was in her bag, and the boat was somewhere out past the harbor, and a man was on it, who'd stolen $40 million, and would not float back, and she had drawn the circle that put him there. She should have felt like a monster. She'd braced to feel like a monster. What she felt instead, God help her, was awake, useful, seen. All the things the mop had taken from her, handed back across a desk by the most dangerous man in the city, at a price she hadn't finished paying and couldn't yet count. Her phone buzzed at 4:11 a.m., a number she didn't have saved. 3 words, the same hard slanted hand, made digital, Fridays handled. Rest. She turned the phone face down on the linoleum. She scratched the cat behind the ear, where he liked it, where he'd always liked it. 17 years of liking it. Outside, the rain kept on, and the radiator ticked, and the whole ruined kingdom of her small life held its breath. Well, Mara said to the cat, out loud, in the empty kitchen, at 4:12 in the morning, there goes the quiet. The cat, who had opinions about the food and none about the money, put his face in the bowl and ate. Mara Koval spent 3 years being furniture, and it took her 9 minutes to stop. 9 minutes, 1 ledger, and a line about air filters that turned 12 of the best forensic minds in the country into statues and put a folder on the desk of a man named Damiano Vale, who does not, as a rule, let people who see too much walk back out the door with their mops. She found his 40 million. She found his thief. And somewhere between the whiskey and the bruise and the 6 bags of cat food outside her door, she found the one thing more dangerous than being invisible, being wanted by a man who always gets what he wants. So what happens to a woman who can read the truth in a page of numbers, now that the most dangerous man in the city knows exactly what she's worth? Does Mara go back to her mop and her 4th-floor walk-up and her dying cat? Or has she already stepped onto a boat of her own, the kind that doesn't float back to the life she had? Tell me in the comments what you think she does next. Walk away or go all the way in. If this one pulled you under, do me a favor. Like the video, share it with someone who loves a slow burn, and subscribe and hit the bell, because the next chapter is where the water gets deep.